Welcome. We're here to talk about budgets. And Neil and I are partner on this with Austin Community College and Alamo colleges because we believe it's very helpful to contrast different ways. Budgets really follow your organization structure on how you operate. And so by contrasting two different methods of how we manage budgeting, we thought it would be helpful for the group. So basically, when you talk about the budget, there's some theoretical concepts of budget. I like to anchor it. First off, as you know, as board members, you approve the annual budget, and it has to be available on our college website, distributed to the state. Also, a key concept is your budget, no matter how you do it, you want to anchor it to your mission. You want to have a close tie to your strategic plan and strategic initiatives. Instead of just funding what you've done before. So I think one of the key practices you want to have is keep that alignment, whatever method you do. Then as far as your policies, you may have set some, your budget policies may differ among all of us, but some of the things that I've seen is you may have kind of a modified zero-based budget, a concept that whether at the end of the year unused funds are swept up to end-of-year fund balance versus rolling over to next year. Like, are there certain accounts that are considered multi-year in budgets? For Alamo colleges, the multi-year would be things like capital accounts. Any restricted funds, obviously, that are there for certain purposes, if whatever's unused will carry forward into the next budget year. The distribution method, part of what we'll contrast is how we decide how we allocate the funds to all the different departments and organizations. So it could be a bottoms up, accumulating submissions from departments, putting that together, looking at strategic alignment, overlaying strategies. That may be one approach. Zero-based, where you basically require every department to start and argue for every amount of funds is an element. Or one that we'll share at Alamo colleges, we do a process that we call a workload based because we have individually accredited colleges and we want to tie it to the students we serve and other workload metrics on how we allocate those funds. Whether the funds can be shifted line to line is normally part of your policy. For us at Alamo colleges, the departments cannot move money from non-labor accounts to labor accounts without it coming through a process. But within non-labor, during the year, after it's approved, they can reallocate as things change during the year to how much is used for certain non-labor. Contingencies. Your policy will determine if, when you set that annual budget at the beginning of the year, if there is a small amount that is some institutional reserve for those unanticipated items that may show up during the year, that gives the chancellor the authority to move money from a reserve account to another budget account without it having come back to the next board meeting. And then other guidelines you may have that you set, whether it's metrics that you want to have as overarching concepts for the budget, such as percent personnel budget, your average class size, any of those kind of things that you may want to have. And then the strategic initiatives, whether you have a pool. We have an actual fund called a Student Success Fund that we established several years ago for funding some very strategic actions that we're taking a multiple year to deploy. And so that may be part of the budget process. To contrast the budget methodologies, on the Austin Community College side, it's a one college concept. 10 campuses, it's under one accreditation for the whole district, one president CEO, one set of administrators, one set of department chairs, so the resources can align very functionally on how that budget is built. At the Alamo colleges, we have 5 colleges, 12 off-site sites supporting the 8-county region. We're individually accredited colleges. Dallas and Alamo are the only 2 that are like that in the state. And so we have 1 chancellor, but we have 5 presidents. We have 5 vice chancellors. We have 3 VPs per college, and 3 sets of department deans and chairs. So because of how we're organized, that impacts how we do our budget. And again, that's why we chose to do a workload allocation model that's very transparent, that allows us to create a pool of funds based on the level of work that we support at each of our locations. So some of the advice to start, just big concepts, think long range when you're thinking as a board member on the budget, that we look at preparing long-term revenue and expense estimates for the state appropriations, for our taxes, for tuition and fees, operating costs, capital needs. You don't want to just look 1 year, you want to think longer term, so you can start planning for what's coming. Some of the revenue estimate questions, just to give you a flavor, the kind of things that your CFOs are looking at as they're going into this, is what's going on with the global, national, state economy. What might be the effect on state appropriations? Our tax revenues up and down. Medicaid, social services. So we're thinking ahead of what's really how tight a year is it potentially going to be on a state appropriations based on what sales taxes is happening and other things. What's our taxing district appraised value outlook for our property tax component? What's going on with financial aid? That could impact your enrollment. What is the political climate affecting these areas, and of course anything else in the world. So we're really trying to think of what are those things that might affect us on the revenue stream before you get too far. I bring this up because sometimes it's helpful to know how we're different from our public universities. And the main difference is in both cases, our tuition and fees have a state subsidy that helps keep our tuition and fee low. That's the concept. You know, we've been fighting that with the state declining on that, on their part of the formula, but the concept is that. And then the main difference is for construction, facilities construction operation at the universities, the state fund that through appropriations, but the community colleges have a property tax capability in Texas to fund that. There's also a difference on the health and retiree benefits. The state funds 100% of that for the universities, but as was discussed in the prior presentation, for community colleges, they started treating us differently than the universities, so now it's a 50-50 split as of several years ago. And big picture is it's challenging times. You know, we have been asked to pressure to turn out more educated, more completions, while at the same time the public funding has been slashed over the last years. It's meant we've had to be more nimble on really trying to move quickly and carve expenses out of our budgets and still grow. This is a slide that actually the Austin Community College has prepared in the past, and I think what's helpful, when you talk to the state legislature, I tell my board, you know, flat's the new growth. If we can just get the same dollars, that's normally the best you can get. But one thing to keep in mind, inflation isn't even in there. Everything costs more. If you look at over time with the inflation impact, not only are we getting less dollars as a pool or $1 per full-time student equivalent or contact hour or success point, but in addition, when you throw in inflation over time, it costs more for everything we buy. And so this really shows with the inflation impacts that can be helpful when you're talking to others on the pressures we face from the state. This is a snapshot just so we could take the 50 community colleges in the state and provide some information to you. You'll have this, I think it's on your USB drive, the presentation. This is for the total tax rates, so you can see what all the colleges are. We organized it from the highest tax rate to the lowest tax rate, and the state average is about 18.5 cents per $100 evaluation on our property tax side. Now, of course, our taxable asset values this rate is applied against is very different for all of us. Every community is different on what you have there on how much it produces as far as revenue, as well as what choices you made on whether you have debt being funded through part of your tax rate or whether you chose to not do that. But this is taking the debt plus the operations side together just to see the big picture. On the tuition and fees, this is similar information. This is for the fall 17. And again, it's the in-district for 12 credit hours. And it also gives you the tuition itself plus the fees, because every institution has a different practice on the level of fees they may have. For instance, Alamo colleges, we used to have tons of fees for every program and all sorts of things. Several years ago, we made a move to move them all into the tuition rate. So there's very little in the fee for us. So that's why we go ahead and take the tuition plus the fees to get a total divided by the 12 hours to kind of give you an all-in rule of thumb of how you stack up with some of the peer institutions. But on average, the state average in district for 12 hours is now $1,081. A total per semester credit hour is at 90 as of this last. But we're still the cheapest in the nation. So we are very affordable for our students. And this shows public two-year colleges across the nation. Texas is just third lowest there, with only New Mexico and California lower than us. So still a great place to be for education. So now I'm going to turn it over to Neil to go ahead and cover the Austin.
Okay, Austin Community College. So as Diane mentioned, ACC for quite a while has operated under a single college concept. And so even though we have actually now 11, soon to be 12 campuses, it's a single college with just multiple locations. That actually allows for a simplified budget process. I think Diane said it well, when it allows us to really budget based off of function as opposed to budget based off of campus or college. So one of the things that I think is really important for your budget process, it can be very daunting, especially for a new trustee. This is no doubt one of the largest decisions, right, that a trustee makes each year. And so I would really encourage the trustees, the colleges, to really be thoughtful about your strategic plan and your board policies. They can really help your budget process because in theory, right, they're guiding your budget process and those other operating decisions. So at ACC, it says master plan. We recently changed that to the strategic plan, but the president and the leadership team, along with the trustees, will develop and eventually approve a 5-year strategic plan. That then guides your budget. So then what we do is the budget process itself becomes really a bottom-up process from our departments, but it's guided by the strategic plan. So we push out those strategic initiatives to the departments and basically say, let us know what the resource needs are for you to achieve the goals set out in the strategic plan. If you can feel confident in your strategic plan and your other governing policies, like your compensation philosophy, I think you'll find that it will kind of smooth the way for your budget process. So then the presenters this morning were saying, what are those kind of trustee questions? So I think a budget question, as opposed to how much are we spending on X supplies, is how is our budget aligned with our strategic plan? How is it meeting the goals of our strategic plan? So obviously you're going to, as Diane pointed out, you spend a lot of time really trying to look at what's going on kind of on a more macro level, and we use this to project out your revenues. At the same time, we're asking departments to let us know what their operational needs are in alignment with that strategic plan. Typically, zero-based budgeting can be very difficult. So you really only want to do that, in my opinion, when the need is there. So typically we start with a base budget. It'll basically be your last year's approved budget, plus or minus any known adjustments. But we then ask departments to let us know if there's any changes that are needed in reflection of the current priorities. As they submit those, they move up the organizational structure, so through their deans and VPs. They will then review those, prioritize those, and then at some point we end up with all of that information coming to the finance office, and we will pull that together, basically collect a list of budget requests, and we will present that to the president along with the rest of the leadership team. At some point, that'll all get prioritized, taking into account revenues available, and that's what will go to the Board of Trustees for approval. Again, with the intent being that those priorities would be able to be aligned with the strategic plan, or at least that would be the message that you would want to take forward to the trustees. This is just a quick, I won't belabor this. We've hit it actually in several of the sessions this morning. It just shows that as the colleges grow over time, and as we've talked about, that the state appropriations tend to be flat. In fact, that's what we budget for in our long-term forecast. You'll see that here in a second. Something has to make up the difference. And so in the middle, you see where property taxes and tuition and fees are the ones that have to grow along with the college in order to pick up that delta over time. We have, I think, done quite well over the years as a college. I know you can't read the numbers, but that's okay. That was intentional, no. We get the smallest font possible to our trustees so they, but we actually have a real simple budget process. Again, because we're really trying to stay focused at the board level, we want to be focused on the really big ideas, right? So there's only about 3 or 4 really key pieces of paper, literally, that we focus on in our budget process with the board. There are some supplemental materials, the compensation plan, the capital and technology plans, but in terms of the real working documents, there's only a few pages. And so one of them, of course, is the revenue summaries. Obviously, we have to start with that, let everybody know how much money is available. We always provide what we had in the prior year, both what was budgeted, but also what the actuals are. So what did we actually bring in? And then what do we project for the upcoming year? And of course, we also have all of the approved tuition rates and if there's any changes in that. And then this is just kind of a one-page snapshot by function, as pointed out a while ago, which works quite well with our one college concept, where we can identify basically the large functions of the college, so your instruction, your student services, your human resources, and so forth. And we can provide what was budgeted last year, any variances that we know of, and then any proposed changes for the upcoming year. You'll notice there's nothing in here for us about campuses again. But we can go in and identify any new initiatives. You see a column called new items. There's actually another page that'll detail what makes up those new items, but they're usually strategic plan priorities or initiatives that would make up those new items. You'll also see right in the center, again, I know you can't really see it, but there's a line that specifically talks to the compensation plan and what's the estimated amount to achieve that. And then we talked, Diane actually mentioned earlier about thinking long-term. So we actually provide annually as part of the budget, a 10-year budget forecast. Now I know what you're thinking. It's like, really, Neil, you know what it's going to look like in 10 years, can you be my investment advisor? But what it's doing is, obviously there's a lot of assumptions in here, but the point of it is, based off how we budget and operate today, what will that look like if the world kind of stays the same, which is a big if, but what you're really looking for is if things are going to stay the same and it looks bad, you'd want to know that early on. And that's what this is trying to do. So it's really saying, let's budget really conservatively, project, and see if it looks like we're still going to have balanced budgets based off how we do business today out into the future. And I think it's worked very well over the years, because we've actually seen times where things start to get rough and you can see, oh my goodness, we're going to have significant tuition increases to balance the budget 3 years from now, based off decisions we're making today in our budget. And so this is what we're trying to give the board so that they can understand that the decision they're making in this year's budget, what's the ripple effect over the next several years of some of those decisions. Obviously, if you're making decisions in compensation, there's a long-term impact of that. as opposed to we're taking some additional funds and putting it into a one-time capital purchase. This would kind of flush that out so you can see what those longer-term impacts are.
For Alamo, we do the workload allocation method because we are trying to create a pool of funds for each of our colleges that's tied to the level, the number of students that we serve, and other key metrics. So, but the first thing we do in our allocation method is we do determine what our baseline revenue. So very similar to what was just described for Austin, we do the same. So we're looking at our formula revenues, what we estimate our taxable property valuation changes would be, and thus what the revenue might be expected if we did no change to our tax rate. For the state, we estimate that. If it's in a legislative cycle, we're running what-ifs at a House, a Senate version, where we think it's going to land. And then tuition and fees, various scenarios calculated if it's flat, if we have some increase of growth in the number of students, or if we are looking for rate changes, we also look at that later in our gap closure kind of analysis. Non-formula, we actually have items that we use non-formula as a term if it's tied to specific programs at a college, at one of our colleges. So we have special program tuition for very high cost programs, nursing, a lot of the very high cost equipment in some of our technical programs. They have to meet a certain criteria, and students pay an additional special program tuition to be part of that. And so the reason we count that as non-formula, when we estimate what that revenue is going to be for the coming year for those programs, then the related college that has that program, of course, gets that money to support those expenses. So that's why we call it non-formula, because it's not the same for every college. It depends on what programs they have. We also have continuing education contracts that may differ by location. We do that there, and some other miscellaneous accounts. I wanted to touch on a few things here, though, that we shared this last year. Is in the big picture on the revenue, we're also talking about where our opportunities are, and that's where we're aligning to our strategies, as well as where we may have risk. So on the state revenue outlook, what we've been talking about with our board, flat is the new growth. We think our opportunity, as discussed in the prior session, is increases in the student success points. That we think we're getting some awareness at the legislative level that funding needs to stay the same or better to fund improvements in that area. And so thus, if we keep increasing our student success points, that's an opportunity for some additional revenues. The risk is we're also working to have students not stay so long and take so many hours. So our contact hours may be having downward pressure in many of our institutions. And so that's also a risk that's going the other way on the tuition and fees. It also, we have, if there's any unfunded mandates where we have to waive tuition that come from the state, of course that can put more downward pressure. So those are the kind of risk in that area. On the property tax side, for us, we've been fortunate in a very diverse economy, so we've had taxable asset value increases. So that means we could have the same rate and produce more revenues there. That's been very important for us at Alamo because we have some very old facilities. And that property tax rate is designed to help us maintain and deal with the critical needs in our facilities area. So when we've had some growth there, that has helped us fund that maintenance and operations and deferred maintenance. It's also, we've been able to mitigate some of the loss from the state through the state revenues. And we've also invested heavily in student support costs, and we've used some of the dollars generated from the tax side that has helped us fund case management advising and some very intensive strategies that are cost intensive. But the risk, one of the big risks that's out there, and in case you haven't heard about it, I just wanted to at least mention it, is the tax, what went through the legislation this year that did not get approved, but we expect it is still going to resurface the next biennium, is this idea of today our rollback rate for the property tax is limited to the 8% difference from the lower of your effective rate or your current rate. So if, like in Alamo colleges, where our taxable asset values for properties are going up, then that means our effective rate is going down. And when you measure that 8% from the lower, then that means without changing our rate, if they reduce this cap from 8% to 5%, that has an impact. We calculated for us about $4 million a year that we might have to lower and lose right at a time when we're doing a CIP build out for a massive $450 million bond election that we're going to need to operate those buildings. So we're starting to have that on our watch list, knowing that in the next biennium that could still resurface. And it would require, they were talking about lowering into possibly a 5% rollback. And the more important, instead of now where it requires enough signatures to require you to have election for your community, it would require a mandatory election, which would have additional costs if you were to exceed that. So this is something, of course, many of you are involved in heavily fighting that concept, and we are hoping to be successful there. On the enrollment, tuition, and fee outlook, our opportunities, we've been focused on encouraging students to take more hours, complete quicker. We have a summer momentum plan that was designed to do that we put in place this last year. And starting, it was mid-year, so we got some great results last summer. Just to share, it was for any student that took a combination of 18 credit hours for fall and spring together, then they qualified for 3 credit hours free in the summer where we gave a scholarship, institutional funds. And if they did 24 as a sum, then they qualified for 6, which would get them on a 2-year graduation, of basically being able to complete in 2 to 3 years. That meant last summer we had $3 million worth of scholarship we did there, but we are starting to see that momentum even this fall with more students knowing about it, to where while we had 3% growth in our enrollment this last fall, we had 4% in our contact hours, so we're starting to move that needle of students taking a few more classes, which we know it helps address the summer melt, that retention of students coming back if they stay in the summer, and we're starting to see promising results in our stats as we keep tracking that cohort to see if it's going to have the benefits we thought. So we did want to at least share that. It is a cost that we're making a bet that this is going to pay out, but again, that aligns right to those success points. Because as more students that complete, ideally we should be getting more money for it. So in the end, it's all we're expecting to fund itself, but it took a little forward investment. Other opportunities, we've had a lot of dual credit growth. For us, that creates expense pressure because we waive 100% of that tuition. And it's a 2-year lag to wait for any funding from the state. And then long-term, we are focused on online and international and some of these where we actually make more money. It's actually more of a profit area that can help mitigate some of the pressures elsewhere. So real quick, here's our process. The operating budget that we do is a 2-step process. We do a high-level Excel model using workload metrics. I'm going to show you real quick. It basically results in a bottom-line total expense budget for each of our 5 colleges and for our district support operations. And then they in the second step, do the detail hard work to take that pool and now further allocate it to the detailed departments of how much they're going to do on tutoring, how much they're going to do on this, but allows us to fairly allocate the pool of funds we have to the colleges based on where we've got the most student growth, what things are happening. And my facilities group is tied to how many square footage do we got to clean, how many acres do we have to mow. So it's using key metrics to drive it. But it allows that detail final decision of who gets what in each of your actual departments to be closer to the operations at our college presidents and their leadership team working through that process. Big picture, we did a change this year to our formula part of the model that I'm going to show you to try to align to our state appropriations. You know, as the state, as you saw, we get core funding, it's basic set dollars for every college, no matter what your volume is. We wanted to align that to do the same thing where we have certain key functions that no matter how many students we have, which we define as our administrator group, we're just going to fund that in the distribution, not make it relational to contact hours or anything. But then we're adding a new incentive, again, to align, to drive, and incent performance within our institution on the student success points. So it's not for 18, but starting in 19, assuming we got more money from the state, which we actually didn't, But if we get a higher rate per, so we get more money for success points, that we made a commitment to the presidents that we would take that pool, and in the following year, it would get distributed in the budget process to help us align and incent the behavior on those strategies that we want. And then our normal formula model I'll show you next, which is really dollar pers on all of these different relational. Our non-formula, we add that in, which is, as we discussed, if they have special program tuition, certain program, then they're going to get the related expense. CE, our continuing ed, is non-formula. We have designed with a strategic initiative that our CE program would reduce $2 million of profit. And so whatever the revenue projection is, then we distribute the expense net of that profit to the related group that manages the delivery of that. And so that's in the budget process. And then we overlay for certain things that we manage at a total level, like our benefits, our student success fund strategies, capital budget, and any full year impact. Let's say last year we had a compensation adjustment, but we did it mid-year. Then we know the following budget year we're going to pick up the full year impact of that of another 4 months for that prior decision. So we would just overlay it, not bury it. And then the key is here is we want the board, when we come forward with any budget information, to know fully the amount of pressure that may be in our budget. I've worked for institutions back in the public, non-educational sector, to where it's all hidden. It's like you run the revenues and you make your expenses equal your revenues, and you just tell everybody this is our expense budget, and everyone says, oh, looks good, it's balanced. No, we run it independently and we talk about the gap. So we run whatever we think our revenue projection is, we run what our expenses to support that are, and we talk about what are our strategies we're going to do to bring them into balance. And so that's full visibility, and that way we know how tight it is going in. Just due to time, I just want to introduce you to the concept, because we only have 5 minutes, is this shows that formula part, and I start with the instruction. So when we talk about what metrics we use in that high-level Excel that creates this pool of money that makes up the college budgets and the district, we start with instruction. It uses all of this is anchored on the last audited period. So we would say, what's the dollar per contact hour across our 28 highest level functional program categories the coordinating board has? And we use what in history we spent for that district-wide, and based on our projection of contact hours in that area for the coming year, then we mathematically calculate the dollars that go with supporting that. So if we expected growth in our nursing program based on our dollars per contact hour in allied health in the last audited period, we would then create a funding pool that goes with that projection. And then we just move around the dial here where academic support is a relationship to instruction. So whatever our instruction dollars are produced, then based on a historic relationship, but we need this amount of money for academic cost on top of instruction, we add a layer for that. We add student services, which is based on head count of students. Advising, we have a new program that's based on one certified advisor for every 350 students. So based on our estimate of students, we calculate out the dollars needed to continue that program. Institutional support is a relationship to what dollars we spend in institutional support to all of those prior categories. And then in our operations and maintenance, which is centralized, we have a facilities group that runs it for district-wide. All housekeeping grounds is all managed in my budget, even if we have people located at the colleges. But we mathematically hold ourselves accountable to efficiencies. So we have metrics of how many square feet per full-time employee on housekeeping, on grounds is on acres, and we calculate that. Utilities, we know we calculate our consumption for all the different utility buckets times the projected rate. So these are just mathematical things you can do. And when we put all that together, the big picture is that single number. We don't require the colleges to spend it in exactly this way. They can still look at their proposal And so then the last piece we do is we also take prior year savings as part of our board policy to encourage people not just to, you've heard of, people have budget money at the end of the year and they buy a bunch of paper or something, just spend it because they don't want to lose it and they want to benefit the prior year. So we put this policy in place that would say 25% of our net savings would roll forward as an add of discretionary funds at a president level or vice chancellor level to be able to spend in the next budget year. So it sent them to save it and be able to use it for other things. We chose 25% because the other 75% helps us fund all those strategic initiatives that we're overlaying to everybody when we launched advising or other things. And then our strategic investments. So the big piece, the last thing is we have a July board retreat where we adopt the budget. And at that's where we really get that final alignment to our strategic plan. Every single vice chancellor and every president prepares a report out of their achievements from the prior year, their goals for the next year aligned to our strategic plan, and the critical pieces of their dollars on how they loaded their dollars of exactly what they plan to spend on what. And so that readout is done in July before the budget's adopted, which allows us to really celebrate how we're able to manage these difficult times and also keep full visibility to the board on what our choices are being made in the budget. And we also posted on our web financial transparency. You can go to this one link. It has everything, all our investment reports. It has all of our checkbook registers, has all of our budgets by year, all of our financial statements. Most of you all have that. You might not have checkbooks. That was something we started doing because of the Transparency Award with the Comptroller's Office in Texas. They encouraged that for transparency. But other than that, that's where you can see our information. And so the last thing, we left a few questions since we wanted to raise this up now that you know the detail work happening behind the curtain. What are things as trustees? Is you want to know what your budget policies say. You want to make sure your facility needs, that you have a plan and you know what those facility master plan is. How often is it updated? Is the budget tied to your strategic plan? And how does it work? What's the basic rules, those rules that are being set? And then what are the long-range implications of today's decisions? That's probably the most important. And are we financially sustainable long-term? So that's where we'll wrap up. And we'll open it for any questions. I know we're out of time. Any? Well, feel free to contact us if you have any.